By the autumn of 1944, the Netherlands had already endured 4 years under the Nazi boot, but nothing could have prepared the Dutch people for what was about to descend upon them. What began in September of that year would become known as the Hongerwinter, the Hunger Winter, and it would claim more Dutch civilian lives than any bombing raid or military engagement throughout the entire occupation. The trouble started immediately after Operation Market Garden failed in late September 1944. This ambitious Allied airborne assault, designed to capture key bridges across the Netherlands and thrust into Germany's industrial heartland, collapsed catastrophically at Arnhem. The defeat left the southern Netherlands liberated, but the densely populated western provinces, home to cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht, still firmly under German control. More critically, it left 4 million Dutch civilians trapped in a pocket that the Wehrmacht had no intention of surrendering peacefully. The German response to Dutch support for the Allied operation was swift and brutal. On 17th September 1944, the Dutch government in exile in London called for a railway strike to hamper German troop movements and assist the Allied advance. Dutch railway workers heeded the call magnificently, with over 30,000 men walking off their jobs. It was an act of extraordinary courage and resistance. But when Market Garden failed, these workers found themselves stranded in hiding, unable to return to work without facing execution, whilst the Germans began their retribution. Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian Nazi who governed the occupied Netherlands, immediately imposed an embargo on all food transport to the western provinces. This was collective punishment on an industrial scale. The canals that Dutch bargemen had used for centuries to move grain, vegetables, and dairy products were placed under military control. Railway lines remained paralyzed by the strike. Road transport was commandeered exclusively for German military purposes. Within weeks, the sophisticated food distribution network that had fed millions simply ceased to function. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. The 1944 harvest had been poor, damaged by early flooding and the chaos of military operations across the country. Food stocks that might have sustained the population through a normal winter were already depleted, and this would be no normal winter. The winter of 1944 to 45 arrived early and with exceptional severity. Canals froze solid by November, eliminating even the possibility of small-scale smuggling by boat. Temperatures plunged to minus 17 degrees Celsius in some regions, and the cold would persist well into April. By December, official rations in the western Netherlands had fallen to around 1,000 calories per day. By February 1945, they had dropped to 580 calories, less than a quarter of what an adult requires simply to survive. People began eating tulip bulbs, not as a quirky wartime recipe, but as a desperate last resort. They stripped bark from trees, boiled leather shoes, and consumed sugar beets intended for industrial processing. Cats, dogs, and rats disappeared from the streets of Amsterdam. The death toll mounted with terrible consistency. Historical records compiled after the war indicate that approximately 22,000 Dutch civilians died directly from starvation and related malnutrition diseases during the Hongerwinter. Thousands more perished from illnesses they might otherwise have survived had their bodies not been weakened by months of hunger. Elderly citizens and young children proved particularly vulnerable. In some Amsterdam neighborhoods, mortality rates quadrupled compared to pre-war averages. This was not merely a food shortage. This was a deliberate policy of starvation, weaponized against a civilian population whose only crime had been supporting their own liberation. And as 1944 turned into 1945, 4 million Dutch civilians faced the very real prospect that liberation might come too late to save them. The strangulation of Western Holland was no accident of war. It was calculated, methodical, and ruthlessly enforced by an occupation apparatus that understood precisely what it was doing. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who would later hang at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, orchestrated a blockade designed to punish Dutch resistance whilst extracting every last resource for the faltering German war machine. Following the railway strike of September 1944, German authorities systematically dismantled the infrastructure that kept Dutch cities alive. They seized approximately 140,000 bicycles from civilians, eliminating personal transport that might have helped families forage for food in rural areas. They confiscated horses, carts, and motor vehicles. They requisitioned fuel supplies and redirected them eastward to support German military operations. The Netherlands, one of Europe's most advanced and interconnected nations, was deliberately reduced to a medieval state of isolation. The Wehrmacht's needs came first in all matters. German troops stationed in the Netherlands consumed substantial food supplies, whilst Dutch civilians starved. Military authorities commandeered warehouses containing grain and dairy products, shipping them to Germany or distributing them exclusively to occupation forces. Dutch farmers in rural areas often had food, but moving it to urban populations became nearly impossible. Anyone caught transporting significant quantities of food without authorization faced immediate arrest and potential execution. The geography of the Western Netherlands made the situation uniquely desperate. This region, much of it reclaimed from the sea over centuries, depended entirely on complex systems of transport and distribution. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague were densely populated urban centres with minimal agricultural capacity within their boundaries. Before the war, these cities received daily shipments of food from the agricultural east and south. Now those supply lines were severed, and millions found themselves trapped on land that could not feed them. By January 1945, the black market had become the only functioning food distribution system. Prices soared to astronomical levels. A single kilogram of bread cost the equivalent of a week's wages for those fortunate enough to still have employment. Families sold furniture, clothing, jewelry, and anything of value to purchase tiny quantities of food. Urban residents made desperate treks into the countryside, walking for dozens of kilometers through frozen landscapes to barter possessions for potatoes or grain. These journeys, undertaken by the already weakened and malnourished, claimed additional lives from exhaustion and exposure. The German military situation grew increasingly precarious as 1945 progressed, but this brought no relief to Dutch civilians. If anything, the approaching collapse made German authorities more determined to extract resources and maintain control. Wehrmacht commanders understood that the Western Netherlands represented a defensive position protecting Germany's northern flank. They had no intention of abandoning it voluntarily, regardless of the civilian cost. Meanwhile, the Dutch resistance continued operating despite the horrific conditions. Underground networks maintained communication with London, documenting the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding and transmitting desperate appeals for assistance. Resistance newspapers, printed secretly and distributed at enormous personal risk, kept the population informed about Allied advances, whilst urging them to hold on just a little longer. But how much longer could they hold? By late February 1945, malnutrition had weakened the population so severely that diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly through communities with compromised immune systems. Hospitals overflowed with patients they could neither feed nor properly treat. Fuel shortages meant many buildings could not be heated, forcing the sick to recover or die in freezing conditions. The mathematics of starvation were becoming unavoidable. Without immediate intervention, the death toll would accelerate exponentially as bodies weakened beyond recovery. 4 million people were running out of time. Queen Wilhelmina was frantic. From her exile in London, the Dutch monarch received daily reports of her people dying in their thousands, and she demanded that something be done. The Dutch government in exile, operating from Stratton House in Piccadilly, mounted an increasingly urgent campaign to convince Allied leadership that the humanitarian crisis in Western Holland required immediate and unconventional action. The problem was deceptively simple to state and enormously difficult to solve. 4 million civilians were starving behind enemy lines. Traditional military logic offered only one solution: liberate the territory. But Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, responsible for the northern sector of the Allied advance, faced strategic priorities that pointed elsewhere. The push into Germany itself, the crossing of the Rhine, and the drive toward Berlin consumed available military resources. Western Holland, whilst containing millions of suffering civilians, held no strategic value that would justify diverting forces from the main offensive. By late February 1945, Dutch officials began exploring an alternative approach. What if food could be delivered by air, dropped directly to the starving population without requiring military liberation first? The concept was not entirely novel. The Royal Air Force had conducted supply drops to resistance forces throughout occupied Europe, but those operations involved small quantities delivered to specific reception committees in remote locations. Feeding 4 million people was an undertaking of an entirely different magnitude. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, serving as commander of the Dutch forces of the interior, became a crucial advocate for the aerial supply concept. He pressed the case directly with Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, arguing that the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding demanded extraordinary measures. Dutch government officials simultaneously worked diplomatic channels, seeking to establish contact with German authorities to negotiate some form of relief arrangement. The first tentative feelers went out in early March 1945. Through intermediaries in neutral Sweden and Switzerland, Allied representatives explored whether German commanders might permit food shipments into occupied Holland. The initial responses were not encouraging. Seyss-Inquart and the German military command showed little inclination toward humanitarian gestures. They understood that starving civilians represented a form of leverage, a population that Allied forces might hesitate to abandon. However, the German position was not monolithic. Within the Wehrmacht command structure, some officers recognized that the war was lost and that their personal futures might depend upon demonstrating some capacity for humane conduct. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German forces in the Netherlands, was a career military officer who had previously clashed with Nazi leadership over SS atrocities in Poland. He represented a potential negotiating partner who might value his post-war reputation above continued resistance. Throughout March, complex and secretive negotiations developed across multiple channels. The Swedish Red Cross offered to serve as intermediaries. Swiss diplomats facilitated communications. And remarkably, direct contacts began occurring between Allied officers and German representatives in the Netherlands itself. The stakes were enormous. Any arrangement would require German forces to hold their fire, whilst Allied aircraft penetrated deep into occupied airspace at extremely low altitudes. A single trigger happy anti-aircraft crew could destroy the fragile trust before any food reached starving civilians. At Bomber Command headquarters in High Wycombe, planners began studying the feasibility of large-scale food drops. The challenges were formidable. Standard bombing altitudes were entirely unsuitable for delivering fragile supplies. Parachutes in sufficient quantities simply did not exist. The payload capacity of available aircraft, whilst substantial for explosives, seemed inadequate for feeding millions. Yet as reports from Holland grew more desperate, the impossible began looking increasingly necessary. By early April 1945, RAF planners were no longer asking whether aerial food delivery could work. They were asking how to make it work before it was too late. Air Vice Marshal Sir Ralph Cochrane faced an operational puzzle unlike anything Bomber Command had previously attempted. His crews had spent years perfecting the art of destroying targets from great height. Now they were being asked to preserve life by flying lower than any bomber pilot would consider sane over territory bristling with German anti-aircraft batteries. The initial planning began in earnest during the first week of April 1945. Cochrane, commanding No. 3 Group, worked closely with Air Commodore Andrew Geddes to transform Lancaster, heavy bombers from instruments of destruction into delivery vehicles for humanitarian aid. The conversion required rethinking almost everything about how these aircraft operated. Standard bombing runs occurred at altitudes between 15,000 and 20,000 feet. At such heights, crews had reasonable protection from light anti-aircraft fire and time to take evasive action against heavier flak. Food drops would require altitudes of approximately 400 feet. Some missions would descend to barely 300 feet. At these heights, a Lancaster travelling at 120 miles per hour would be visible, audible, and horrifyingly vulnerable to even a soldier with a rifle. The technical challenges extended beyond altitude. Dropping supplies accurately without parachutes demanded precise calculations. Crews would need to release cargo at exact moments to ensure packages landed in designated zones rather than scattering across urban areas, or worse, crashing through the roofs of buildings sheltering the very people they were meant to save. RAF engineers experimented with different release mechanisms and studied how various package configurations behaved when dropped from low-flying aircraft. The Lancaster's bomb bay could accommodate substantial cargo, but filling it with food required modifications. Ground crews removed bombing equipment and installed makeshift platforms and containers. Each aircraft could carry approximately 2 tons of supplies, modest compared to the need, but significant when multiplied across hundreds of sorties. Sourcing appropriate supplies presented another challenge. Would not injure civilians when landing, would not injure civilians when landing. RAF planners coordinated with the Ministry of Food and various military supply organisations to assemble appropriate provisions. The final supply manifests would include flour, dried egg powder, tinned meat, chocolate, margarine, sugar, dried milk, and yes, vegetables, tinned peas, beans, and carrots that could provide essential vitamins to populations suffering from severe nutritional deficiencies. The operation received the code name Manna, a biblical reference that crews immediately appreciated. Just as the Israelites received bread from heaven during their exodus, the Dutch would receive sustenance falling from RAF Lancasters. It was perhaps the only occasion during the entire war when Bomber Command crews would fly missions knowing their cargo would save lives, rather than end them. Designated drop zones required careful selection. They needed to be large enough to accommodate scattered packages, clear of tall structures, and accessible to distribution teams on the ground. Racecourses, airfields, and large parks emerged as primary candidates. Dutch resistance networks, still operating despite the horrific conditions, would coordinate ground-level collection and distribution. By mid-April, aircraft modifications were progressing and supply stockpiles were growing, but one enormous uncertainty remained: The entire operation depended upon German forces holding their fire. Without a reliable ceasefire agreement, sending Lancasters over occupied Holland at 400 feet would be sending crews to certain death. The diplomatic negotiations that had begun tentatively in March now became desperately urgent. Bomber Command could prepare aircraft, train crews, and stockpile supplies. But until someone convinced the Germans to let the mission proceed unmolested, Operation Manna would remain nothing more than an elaborate plan gathering dust in filing cabinets at High Wycombe. The negotiations that would determine whether Operation Manna succeeded or became a massacre unfolded across multiple locations with agonizing slowness. Every day of delay meant more Dutch civilians dying from starvation, yet rushing into a poorly constructed agreement could mean Lancaster crews dying in their hundreds over the flat, exposed terrain of Western Holland. The breakthrough came through an unlikely intermediary. Jacob van der Gaag, a Dutch resistance leader operating under the codename Donson, established contact with German officials willing to discuss humanitarian arrangements. Through this channel, word reached General Johannes Blaskowitz that the Allies were serious about attempting aerial food drops. Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group H in the Netherlands, found himself weighing military duty against pragmatic recognition that Germany's defeat was now inevitable. On 25th April 1945, senior representatives met at a schoolhouse in Achterveld, a small village on the dividing line between Allied-held and German-occupied territory. The Allied delegation included Major General Sir Francis de Guingond, Montgomery's Chief of Staff, alongside Soviet observer Major General Ivan Susloparov. The German delegation was led by Ernst Schwebel, Seyss-Inquart's Chief of Staff. The atmosphere was tense, formal, and laden with mutual suspicion. De Guingond presented the Allied position directly. The food drops would proceed. The only question was whether German forces would permit them to occur peacefully, or whether the Allies would hold German commanders personally responsible for any crews killed during humanitarian missions. This was not merely diplomatic language. Were complicated by Seyss-Inquart's position. The Reichskommissar remained fanatically loyal to Nazi ideology and initially resisted any arrangement that might be construed as cooperation with the enemy. However, even Seyss-Inquart recognized that his personal survival might depend upon demonstrating some humanitarian conduct in the war's final days. His calculations were coldly self-interested rather than compassionate, but they pointed toward permitting the food drops. A provisional agreement emerged from Achterveld. German forces would hold fire during designated food drop operations conducted along specified routes and within specified time windows. In exchange, the Allies would provide guarantees about the exclusively humanitarian nature of the missions: no reconnaissance photography, no weapons, no military personnel beyond aircraft crews. Yet uncertainty persisted. The agreement was provisional, requiring confirmation from higher authorities. Communications within the crumbling German command structure were unreliable. Local commanders might not receive orders in time, or might choose to ignore them. Anti-aircraft crews, after years of shooting at Allied bombers, might fire instinctively before recognizing the unusual nature of these missions. Bomber Command crews preparing for Operation Manna understood these risks with uncomfortable clarity. Intelligence briefings emphasized that whilst negotiations were progressing, no absolute guarantee of safety existed. Flight Lieutenant Robert Wannop, a Lancaster pilot with 617 Squadron, later recalled being told that crews were not obligated to volunteer for missions where ceasefire arrangements remained unconfirmed. Almost universally, crews volunteered anyway. The final confirmation came on 28th April 1945. German forces agreed to hold fire during food drop operations commencing the following day. Specific flight corridors were designated, running from the Allied lines to drop zones at Valkenburg Airfield near The Hague, the Ypenburg Aerodrome, and race courses at Rotterdam and The Hague. Aircraft would display identification markings and fly precisely along agreed routes. Whether this fragile truce would hold when hundreds of heavy bombers thundered over German positions remained to be seen. The crews of Bomber Command would discover the answer soon enough. Operation Manna was cleared for launch on 29th April 1945. The morning of 29th April 1945 dawned grey and overcast across eastern England. At airfields scattered throughout Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and East Anglia, Lancaster crews completed their final preparations for the most unusual mission of their careers. Instead of bomb trolleys laden with high explosives, ground crews loaded sacks of flour, crates of tinned goods, and parcels of chocolate and dried egg. For the first time, these bombers would bring life rather than death. The first wave launched shortly after midday. Approximately 242 Lancasters from numbers 1, 3, and 8 groups rumbled down runways and climbed into formation, turning eastward toward the North Sea. Navigators plotted courses for the designated corridors that would carry them over still occupied Holland. Gunners sat at their positions, under strict orders not to fire unless directly engaged. The tension in those aircraft was unlike anything crews had experienced over Germany's most heavily defended targets. Flight Lieutenant Wannop, flying with 617 Squadron, later described the approach to the Dutch coast as the longest minutes of his life. Every crew member watched the ground below for the telltale flash of anti-aircraft fire. The agreed ceasefire was barely 24 hours old. Would German gunners honour it? Would local commanders have received their orders? Would some fanatical Nazi unit decide to take a final shot at the hated RAF? The anti-aircraft batteries remained silent. As the Lancasters crossed into occupied territory and descended toward their drop zones, crews witnessed scenes that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Dutch civilians emerged from buildings, flooding into streets and climbing onto rooftops. They waved sheets, tablecloths, flags, anything visible from the air. Some had painted messages on rooftops. "Thank you, boys," read one. "God bless you," proclaimed another. Years of occupation had not extinguished Dutch gratitude for their approaching liberation. Over the designated drop zones, bomb bay doors opened and supplies tumbled earthward. Without parachutes, the packages fell rapidly, striking the ground with considerable force. Ground crews organised by the Dutch resistance scrambled to collect supplies before they could be damaged or looted. The system was improvised, occasionally chaotic, but functional. Food that had been loaded in England that morning reached Dutch distribution centres by evening. The first day's drops delivered approximately 534 tons of supplies. It was a beginning, but the need was vast. Manna continued the following day, and the day after that. Each mission refined the process. Crews learned which release techniques produced the most concentrated drops. Ground teams improved their collection efficiency. Drop zones expanded to include additional locations as the operation gained momentum. Rear gunners, accustomed to scanning skies for Luftwaffe fighters, now watched crowds of Dutch civilians cheering below. Wireless operators received messages of thanks transmitted from resistance radio stations. For crews who had spent years delivering destruction, the emotional impact was profound. Sergeant Ronald Hurst, a flight engineer with 12 Squadron, later reflected that these missions made sense of everything they had endured during the bombing campaign. The war finally had a purpose beyond destruction. The human details were sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes beautiful. Crews reported seeing emaciated figures barely able to stand, waving weakly at passing aircraft. They saw children running alongside moving vehicles, loaded with supplies, desperate for whatever scraps might fall. They saw Dutch flags appearing on buildings that had displayed swastikas just days before. By 1st May, Operation Manna had established a rhythm. Lancasters departed England each morning, crossed the North Sea, descended over Holland, released their cargo, and returned home. The ceasefire held. Not a single aircraft was lost to enemy fire during food drop operations. The impossible had become routine. Across the Atlantic, American commanders watched Operation Manna with keen interest. The humanitarian catastrophe in Holland was not exclusively a British concern, and the United States 8th Air Force possessed substantial capacity that could dramatically increase supply deliveries. On 1st May 1945, American B-17 Flying Fortresses joined the effort under their own operation codename, Chowhound. The American contribution was immediate and substantial. The 8th Air Force dispatched approximately 400 B-17 bombers on the first day of Chowhound, nearly doubling the daily tonnage, reaching starving Dutch civilians. These aircraft operated from bases across southern England, flying parallel routes to their RAF counterparts and utilizing additional drop zones to expand geographic coverage. The B-17 crews faced identical challenges to their British allies. Low-altitude flying over occupied territory required trust in a ceasefire negotiated by commanders most aircrew had never met. American pilots descended to altitudes that felt suicidal after years of high-altitude operations. Waist gunners and tail gunners watched German positions slide past below, half expecting the familiar flash of flak batteries opening fire. Technical Sergeant Elmer Crockett, flying with the 308th Bombardment Group, recalled the surreal experience of approaching a target without defensive maneuvers. Standard operating procedure demanded constant course changes to confuse anti-aircraft predictors. Over Holland, crews flew straight and level, following precise corridors, trusting their lives to diplomatic agreements signed in schoolhouses. The combined Anglo-American effort achieved remarkable scale. Between 29th April and 8th May 1945, Operation Manna delivered approximately 6,980 tons of supplies. Operation Chowhound contributed approximately 4,000 tons during its slightly shorter operational period. Together, nearly 11,000 tons of food reached Western Holland through aerial delivery alone. The supplies themselves reflected careful consideration of nutritional requirements. Flour constituted a substantial portion of deliveries, providing the basis for bread production that could feed large numbers efficiently. Dried egg powder offered concentrated protein to populations suffering severe deficiencies. Margarine and cooking fats provided calories essential for recovery. Tinned vegetables, those famous peas and beans, delivered vitamins that fresh produce would have provided under normal circumstances. Chocolate held particular significance beyond its caloric value. For Dutch children who had survived months of near starvation, chocolate represented something almost forgotten: pleasure, sweetness, normalcy. American crews reportedly added personal touches to some parcels, including notes of encouragement and small luxuries beyond official manifests. These gestures, whilst militarily insignificant, carried profound emotional weight for recipients. The logistics of ground-level distribution improved daily. Dutch resistance networks, supplemented by emerging local authorities, anticipating liberation, established increasingly efficient collection and allocation systems. Food moved from drop zones to distribution centers to individual families through chains of volunteers who themselves were weakened by months of hunger. The effort required reserves of strength that malnourished bodies could barely provide. Medical assessments conducted during this period revealed the scale of physiological damage inflicted by the Hongerwinter. Average body weights had declined by 15 to 25% across the population. Edema from protein deficiency was widespread. Children showed significant developmental delays. The food drops provided immediate calories, but recovery would require months of proper nutrition. Crucially, the aerial deliveries bought time. Ground supply convoys began reaching liberated areas even as airdrops continued. Swedish Red Cross shipments, negotiated through separate diplomatic channels, supplemented Allied military supplies. The combination prevented the mass mortality that had seemed inevitable just weeks earlier. By 7th May 1945, German forces in the Netherlands were preparing to surrender. Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound had accomplished their mission. The final flights departed on 8th May, Victory in Europe Day. Canadian forces crossed into Western Holland on 5th May 1945, finally liberating the population that had endured 7 months of deliberate starvation. The scenes that greeted them confirmed every desperate report that had reached Allied command. Emaciated civilians lined roadsides, some too weak to stand, others weeping with relief. The liberation they had awaited so long had finally arrived, and for most, the aerial food drops had provided just enough sustenance to survive until this moment. The formal German surrender in the Netherlands occurred on 5th May, signed by General Blaskowitz at the Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen. Seyss-Inquart, the architect of so much Dutch suffering, attempted to negotiate favourable terms for himself, but found little sympathy. He would face trial at Nuremberg and hang on 16th October 1946 for crimes against humanity, including his deliberate starvation policies during the Hongerwinter. The immediate aftermath required continued humanitarian effort. Liberation alone could not repair bodies damaged by months of malnutrition. Allied medical teams established feeding programs designed to gradually restore caloric intake without overwhelming digestive systems weakened by prolonged hunger. The phenomenon of refeeding syndrome, where sudden access to food can prove fatal to the severely malnourished, required careful management. Statistical assessments conducted after liberation quantified the catastrophe. Approximately 22,000 Dutch civilians died directly from starvation and malnutrition-related illness during the Hongerwinter. Thousands more perished from diseases their weakened bodies could not resist. The total excess mortality during the occupation's final winter exceeded 30,000. Without Operations Manna and Chowhound, historians estimate these figures would have been substantially higher, perhaps doubled or worse. The long-term health consequences extended across generations. Dutch researchers subsequently conducted extensive studies on Hongerwinter survivors and their descendants. Children conceived during the famine showed elevated rates of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes in later life, a phenomenon demonstrating how prenatal malnutrition permanently alters metabolic function. These findings contributed significantly to scientific understanding of developmental origins of adult disease. For the aircrew who participated, Operations Manna and Chowhound represented transformative experiences. Men who had spent years dropping bombs on German cities found unexpected redemption in delivering food to starving civilians. Flight Lieutenant Wonop later described the food drops as the finest thing Bomber Command ever did. Many veterans maintained lifelong connections with the Netherlands, returning for anniversary commemorations and forming friendships with Dutch families who remembered their aircraft passing overhead. The Dutch people institutionalized their gratitude in remarkable ways. Every year since 1945, the Netherlands has sent thousands of tulip bulbs to Canada in thanks for the liberation. Dutch communities near former drop zones erected monuments honouring Manna and Chowhound crews. Streets bear names commemorating the operations. Schools teach children about the bombers that brought vegetables instead of destruction. Perhaps most touchingly, many Dutch families preserved items from the food drops as treasured heirlooms. Empty flour sacks became tablecloths. Chocolate tin wrappers were framed. These humble objects, representing survival against calculated murder, passed from generation to generation as physical evidence of deliverance. The story of Operation Manna offers something increasingly rare in accounts of the Second World War: unambiguous heroism without moral complexity. Lancaster and flying fortress crews risked their lives not to destroy an enemy but to save innocent civilians. German officers chose to hold fire rather than add final atrocities to already lengthy charge sheets. Dutch civilians survived through resilience, solidarity, and faith that liberation would eventually come. 4 million people faced annihilation through deliberate starvation. Bombers that had rained destruction across Europe became instruments of salvation, and vegetables tumbling from aircraft bomb bays helped preserve a nation until freedom arrived. Some stories from history deserve remembering precisely as they happened.